The gun was already drawn when Rose Easton came running out of the dark tree line, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair wild and loose around her face, and the look in her eyes was not one of a woman who had simply been startled by a rabbit in the brush. It was the look of a woman who had seen something that could not be unseen, heard something that could not be unheard, and was now carrying that terrible knowledge like a stone pressed flat against her sternum. She ran straight toward the creek, and Marshal Cornelius Hayes was already there, the way he always was, standing at the bank with the last red light of the evening behind him. And when he saw her coming, he moved without thinking, holstering his weapon and opening his arms because some part of him had always known that one evening she would come running rather than walking. She slammed into him with enough force to knock a lesser man sideways. He held. "They know," she gasped against his chest. "Cornelius, they know everything, about the deed, about what my father left me, about all of it." He did not ask who they were, he already knew. He had known for 3 weeks, ever since he had started waiting at this creek, and the reason he had started waiting was precisely because he had understood, even before she did, that Rose Easton was standing directly in the center of a trap that had been set long before she ever arrived in Harlan Creek, Colorado. His hand moved to the back of her head, steadying her, and he felt the fine trembling that ran through her whole body like a current. "You are safe," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that had talked men down from ledges, that had called out across open fields to outlaws who had nothing left to lose. It was not soft, it was certain. "Right now, in this moment, you are safe." She pulled back far enough to look at his face, and her eyes were dark with something that was not purely fear. It was anger and betrayal, and underneath both of those things, something she had been trying to name for weeks and had not yet allowed herself to name. "How long have you known?" she asked. The evening light was dying fast. The creek murmured beneath the cottonwoods, indifferent and eternal, the way water always is when human lives are burning down around it. "Long enough," Cornelius Hayes said. "Long enough that I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the only honest one he had. And there, at Harlan Creek in the autumn of 1884, the story of how they had arrived at this moment, of a solitary marshal and a woman who came to the water every evening, of secrets buried in land deeds and old grudges, and something far more powerful than either of those things began to unspool from the beginning. Rose Easton had come to Harlan Creek in the first week of September, 2 years after her father, Thomas Easton, had died in a boarding house in Denver with no one beside him but a physician he had hired by the hour. Thomas Easton had spent 30 years making enemies, and the last 5 of those years trying to make one thing that would outlast him. He had purchased land. 40 acres of it, sitting at the southern edge of Harlan Creek, land that everyone else in the territory had dismissed as too rocky and too dry for farming, and too remote for any sensible ranching operation. Thomas Easton had not been a sensible man, but he had been an observant one, and what he had observed was that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was quietly buying up corridors of land across Colorado, and that the route they were most likely to push south would run directly through or directly adjacent to those 40 acres. He had written this down in a letter to his daughter, sealed it, and given it to his attorney in Denver with instructions that it was to be delivered to Rose Easton upon the transfer of the deed to her name, which would occur automatically upon his death. The attorney, a man named Percival Croft, had delivered the letter. What Thomas Easton had not anticipated was that Percival Croft was also the personal attorney of a man named Douglas Vane, who was Harlan Creek's largest landowner, its most prominent citizen, and the single individual who stood to lose the most if the railroad came through, and Rose Easton held title to land that sat directly at the junction of what would become the most valuable corridor in the county. Percival Croft had read the letter before he sealed it. He had told Douglas Vane what was in it within 48 hours. Rose had known none of this when she packed her trunk in Denver, settled her affairs at the millinery shop where she had worked for 4 years, and boarded the stage south toward Harlan Creek. She was 26 years old, of reasonable health, a clear and practical mind, and a stubbornness of character that her father had alternately admired and despaired of. She had dark hair and dark eyes, and the kind of stillness about her face that people sometimes mistook for coldness until she laughed, and then they understood it was simply concentration. She had not expected to inherit anything from a father she had seen perhaps a dozen times in her adult life. She had certainly not expected to inherit a piece of land that was going to make powerful men want to destroy her. She arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday, in a stage that deposited her and 3 other passengers at the front of the Silver Bell Hotel. The town was larger than she had expected from the name, though it wore its size like a coat that was slightly too large for it. The main street broad and sun-bleached, the buildings uneven, some of them well-built, and some of them clearly constructed in haste during some earlier period of optimism. The first person who formally introduced himself to her was Douglas Vane. He was waiting, in fact, which she should have recognized as strange, at the hotel's front steps. He was 61 years old, a wide man with a face that had been handsome once and was now carrying too many years of hard satisfaction. He had silver hair and a coat that cost more than most men in that town made in a month, and he smiled at her with the particular warmth of a man who wants something. "Miss Easton," he said, "I had word you were arriving today. Your father was known to me. I wanted to personally extend the hospitality of Harlan Creek." She shook his hand because she was too tired from 2 days of stage travel to be suspicious yet, and because nothing in his manner was overtly alarming. He was simply a large man being gracious. "I appreciate the welcome," she said. "If there is anything I can do to help you settle in, to understand the particulars of your inheritance, please come to me directly. I have extensive knowledge of the land records in this county." He said this last part with a slight emphasis that she filed away without yet knowing why. She spent her first few days learning the town. She found the general store, run by a woman named Hannah Briggs, whose husband had died of fever the previous winter, and who was managing alone with a composure that Rose found instantly admirable. She found the schoolhouse, which had a teacher and 8 students and a roof that was clearly going to need replacing before the first snow. She found the Marshal's office, a low building on the east end of the main street, with a jail cell in the back that smelled of tobacco and old wood, and a desk at the front where a man sat reading a report with the careful attention of a man who took reports seriously. Cornelius Hayes was 32 years old, which she did not know at first and would not learn for several weeks. He was not a physically imposing man in the way that some lawmen were, not built for the impression of force, though he was plainly strong in a quiet and functional way, the way a good tool is strong, without excess or decoration. He had a face that was difficult to read on first acquaintance, angular and weathered, with gray eyes that moved carefully over things and people, and did not rush to conclusions. He had been Marshal of Harlan Creek for 3 years, sent by the territorial office after the previous Marshal had been killed in a dispute that had less to do with lawbreaking and more to do with Douglas Vane wanting a particular piece of contested property and a previous owner who had refused to sell. That was the thing that the territorial office understood and had not told Cornelius Hayes directly, but had implied with sufficient clarity. Harlan Creek had a Vane problem, and it needed a Marshal who could manage it without starting a war. What they had found in Cornelius Hayes was a man who had spent 6 years as a deputy in 3 different towns, who had a reputation for patience and precision, who had never once drawn his weapon without cause, and who had a particular quality that was rare in frontier law enforcement, which was that he listened to people before he acted on what he heard. He had a dark past of his own, which was the particular kind that is less dramatic than people imagine and more permanently painful. He had been engaged once, 5 years ago, to a woman named Clara in Pueblo, and she had died of typhoid 3 weeks before their wedding date. He had not spoken about this to anyone in Harlan Creek. He had carried it the way men of his type carried grief, which is to say inward and without ceremony, which is also to say that it had shaped him into someone who understood the full weight of loss and could therefore recognize it in others. Rose Easton came into the Marshal's office on her 4th day in Harlan Creek because she wanted to register her presence formally and to understand what the law in this town looked like. She had grown up in Denver, and she had seen enough of what happened to women alone in western towns, without established presence with the law, to know that making herself visible was a form of protection. Cornelius Hayes looked up from his desk when she came in, and she saw him assess her in the practiced way of a lawman, quick and thorough and without apparent judgment. "Marshal Hayes," she said, "my name is Rose Easton. I have recently inherited property south of town and I intend to stay. I thought it sensible to introduce myself." "Miss Easton," he said, and stood, which she noted. Men who stood when a woman entered were not common enough. "I had heard you were arriving. Please sit down." "You had heard." She sat in the chair across from his desk with her back straight. "In a town this size, most things are heard," he said. "Your father owned the Easton parcel. I know the land. 40 acres, southern edge of the creek boundary runs along Vane's western fence line." He said this last part without particular emphasis, the way you state a fact that is both accurate and significant. She looked at him for a moment. "You say that as though it matters where the boundary runs." "It might," he said. "Are you planning to farm the land, or have you other purposes for it?" She told him about the letter from her father, about the railroad, about what Thomas Easton had believed. She told him because he was the law and because she had spent 4 days in this town and already felt the particular unease of being watched more than the ordinary curiosity due a newcomer. She did not tell him everything about the letter, but she told him enough. He listened without interrupting, which was the second thing she noted about him. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Miss Easton, I am going to tell you something that I am asking you to keep between us for the present time, because I do not yet have the evidence to act on it formally." "Tell me," she said. "Douglas Vane has made 2 previous attempts to acquire the Easton parcel since your father died. Both times he was told the land had passed to an heir and was not available. I believe he expected you to arrive, accept a reasonable offer for land you had never seen, and leave. I believe his calculation changes significantly if you are planning to stay and develop the property." She felt the cold clarity of that settle through her. "You are telling me I am in danger." "I am telling you to be careful," he said, which is not quite the same thing, but it is adjacent to it. She stood to leave, and at the door she turned back to look at him. "Are you going to do something about this, Marshal?" "I am already doing something about it," he said. "I have been for 6 months. But evidence gathered carefully holds more weight than evidence gathered quickly, and I need you to be patient with me." She was not, by nature, a patient woman. But she recognized the logic of what he was saying. "I walk to the creek every evening," she said. "I find it helps me think. The water is about a half-mile south from the hotel." She did not know, at that moment, why she told him that. Later she would understand it was because some part of her already trusted him and some other part of her was already, in some way she would have firmly denied, hopeful. "The path through the cottonwoods can be difficult to navigate once the light goes," he said, and his expression had shifted to something she could not quite read. "After dark, especially." She nodded and left. And the following evening, when she walked to the creek for the first time, she found him there already, standing at the bank in the late orange light, looking at the water. He did not make a show of his presence. He did not perform any gallantry. He simply was there, and when she arrived, he said, "Evening, Miss Easton." And when she was ready to walk back, he walked beside her, and nothing about any of it was explained or formalized. It simply happened, the way some things happen when 2 people are alike in the ways that matter and have found each other in a place where those qualities are needed. It happened again the 2nd evening, and the 3rd. By the end of the 1st week, it was simply a fact of Rose Easton's life in Harlan Creek that the marshal waited at the creek every evening and walked her back before dark, and she found she was not merely tolerating this, but genuinely looking forward to it in a way that she examined carefully and honestly and decided was not weakness, but was something else entirely. In those walks they talked. This was the part that surprised her most. She had expected a frontier lawman to be a man of few words and blunt opinions, and Cornelius Hayes was certainly economical with language, but what he said when he said something was always worth the hearing. He had opinions on things she had not expected, on the territorial question, on the push for statehood, on the treatment of the Ute people who had been displaced from land in this very part of Colorado just 4 years earlier in what the newspapers called a resolution, and what Cornelius Hayes called a shame that would not wash off. "You think about those things," she said on the fourth evening. It was not quite a question. "I am a lawman," he said. "I think about what the law does and does not do for people. And I have seen enough to know that the law as written and the law as practiced are sometimes very different things, and that the difference falls hardest on people who already have the least." She walked beside him in the last of the evening warmth and thought about her father, who had never thought about such things at all, and about herself, who had thought about them her whole life and had sometimes felt lonely in the thinking. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Less," she said honestly. "I expected considerably less." He glanced at her, and in the dying light she saw something cross his face that was quickly and carefully put away, the way a man puts away something he is not yet ready to speak about. The evenings continued. October began to draw the gold out of the cottonwoods, and the air began to carry that particular sharpness that precedes mountain winter. Douglas Vane visited Rose at the hotel twice. The first visit he was cordial and offered to buy the land for what he called a fair market price, which was enough money to live comfortably on for several years if she was careful. She told him she would consider it. The second visit he was still cordial, but the cordiality had grown a very slight edge, like a letter opener that is also, technically, a knife. "Miss Easton," he said on the second visit, sitting across from her in the hotel's small parlor with his hat in his hands, "I hope you understand that I make this offer out of genuine care for your situation. A single woman alone on 40 acres of frontier land with winter coming faces real hardships. I would hate to see you suffer difficulties that could so easily be avoided." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you expressing concern for my welfare, Mr. Vane, or are you describing what might happen to me if I decline your offer?" The edge became briefly visible in his expression and then was smoothed over again. "I am simply being realistic," he said. "This is hard country. It is not kind to those who misunderstand its nature." After he left, she sat in the parlor for a long time and then went to the marshal's office and told Cornelius Hayes what had been said. He listened with his particular quality of stillness and then said, "That is close enough to a threat that it gives me something to work with, but not quite close enough to act on directly. Vane is careful. He always has been." He paused. "Did he bring anyone with him?" "A man named Cutter. He waited outside." Cornelius Hayes's expression changed in a way she had come to recognize, a tightening around the eyes that was not anger exactly but was something adjacent to it and colder. "Frank Cutter," he said. "He works for Vane. He has worked for Vane for 11 years. In that time, there have been 4 incidents of violence or property destruction in this county that I believe trace back to Vane's operations, and in each case Cutter was present in the vicinity, and in each case there was insufficient evidence to formally charge either of them." "What kind of incidents?" she asked. He told her. A barn fire that had ruined a family named Whitmore who had refused to sell their land to Vane 3 years ago. A beating administered to a young man named Reyes who had been a witness in a property dispute that had eventually gone Vane's way. A poisoned water source on a small holding to the north. A forged signature on a deed transfer that Cornelius had spent 4 months tracing and had ultimately been able to prove was forged. But by then the land had already changed hands twice more, and untangling it was legally impossible. Rose sat with all of this. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was honest enough with herself to know that what she felt sitting in the Marshal's office in the October afternoon was something real and warranted. "I am not going to sell," she said. "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice that she did not name right then but that she kept. "What do I do?" "You continue your daily life," he said. "You give him nothing, you let me gather what I need to gather, and you do not walk to the creek alone after I have told you to wait for me." She almost smiled at that last part. "You have not told me to wait for you, you have simply appeared." "I am telling you now," he said. "Do not go to the creek alone, wait for me." She looked at him and felt something shift in her chest that she had been carefully holding still for weeks. "All right," she said. "I will wait for you." There were two things happening simultaneously in those October weeks, and one of them was the visible, practical thing, which was Rose Easton establishing herself in Harlan Creek, and the other was the invisible, inevitable thing, which was the growing weight of what was between her and Cornelius Hayes. She noticed the particular way he adjusted his pace to hers on the path back from the creek, the way he was always slightly behind and to her right, which she eventually understood was deliberate positioning, the right side being the side from which a threat was most likely to approach on that particular path. She noticed that he always knew when she had had a difficult day, and she had no idea how he knew this because she was careful with her expressions. But he would find some reason to mention something that made her laugh, not a contrived or performative laugh but a real one, and she could feel each time that it came from a genuine instinct in him to relieve the weight she was carrying. She noticed that when she talked, he did not wait for her to finish so that he could say his own thing but actually listened, absorbed, responded to what she had actually said rather than to what he had already decided she probably meant. She noticed that he never, in all their evenings at the creek, looked at her the way some men looked at a woman, with the particular combination of assessment and entitlement that she had spent her adult life navigating. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he considers important and is not sure he deserves. She was 30 days into her time in Harlan Creek when she acknowledged to herself, honestly and without softening, that she was in serious danger of falling entirely in love with Cornelius Hayes, and that this was, given everything else that was happening, possibly the worst timing in the continental United States. She told this to Hannah Briggs, the store owner, on a bright October morning when they were drinking coffee and Hannah was showing her the account she was struggling to balance, because Rose had a good head for figures and Hannah had accepted help without drama and they had become, quickly and without fanfare, genuine friends. "The Marshal," Hannah said without apparent surprise. "Is it obvious?" "Only to someone who has watched you both," Hannah said. "Which in this town is everyone. The question is what you are going to do about it." "Nothing," Rose said. "I am going to do nothing about it because I am in the middle of a situation that requires clear thinking, and because he is the law in this town and it would be inappropriate." Hannah Briggs, who had spent 3 years married to a man she adored and 2 years grieving him, gave Rose a look of measured patience. "Rose," she said, "the appropriate moment is a luxury that the frontier does not generally offer. You take what you have when you have it." Rose said nothing. She looked at the account books and did not say that she had been awake the previous evening thinking about the exact quality of the silence between her and Cornelius Hayes at the creek, a silence that was the most fully inhabited silence she had ever sat inside, full of everything that was going unsaid, and the particular warmth of knowing that the unsaid things were mutual. The trouble arrived in the second week of October, though Rose did not know it had arrived until several days after the fact. A man named Jesse Pratt came to Harlan Creek, ostensibly as a buyer for the hotel, which had been rumored for some time to be considering a sale. He was plausible and had money and made enough of a social entrance that people paid attention to his presence in the ordinary way. What Rose did not know, because she had no reason to know it, was that Jesse Pratt had been hired by Douglas Vane and was in Harlan Creek not to buy the hotel, but to find the copy of the survey documentation that Thomas Easton had lodged with the county recorder's office. Documentation that precisely established the boundary of the Easton parcel relative to the existing county road and to Vane's fence line, a boundary that Vane had been quietly, illegally pushing westward for 2 years by moving fence posts incrementally in the way that a man moves fence posts when he believes no one is watching and when the person who would notice is dead. Thomas Easton had noticed before he died. It was in the letter. Rose had not fully understood the significance of it until she read it again in light of what Cornelius had told her about Vane, and then she had understood that her father had not simply been speculating about the railroad. He had been documenting an ongoing theft. She brought the letter to Cornelius on a Wednesday afternoon. She watched him read it and watched the quality of his stillness shift into something that was carefully controlled alertness. "He has been encroaching on your land for 2 years, Cornelius said. "If the survey documentation at the recorder's office confirms this, and I believe it does, then Douglas Vane has a problem that goes beyond wanting to buy your parcel at a favorable price. He has a legal exposure, which means he needs more than to buy my land," she said slowly. "He needs the original survey documents, or the letter, or both. He needs the case against him to disappear," Cornelius said. He set the letter down on his desk and looked at her with that gray directness. "Miss Easton, Rose, I need you to listen to me very carefully." She had never heard him use her given name before. It moved through her like warm water. "I am listening," she said. "Jesse Pratt is not here for the hotel. I have been watching him for 4 days. He is working for Vane. What he is looking for, I believe, is either the original survey documentation or evidence of what your father recorded before he died. If he finds this letter or finds the deed or finds the county recorder's copies, Vane has people in place to ensure those documents are altered or destroyed. Then we need to get to the recorder's office before he does." "I went yesterday," Cornelius said. "I pulled certified copies of everything, and I have them secured. What I need now is a witness to the boundary discrepancy, someone besides me, because I am a party in interest as the law enforcement agent and Vane's lawyers will challenge my testimony alone." "What kind of witness?" "Someone who has walked that boundary. Someone with their own observation of where Vane's fence actually sits relative to where the survey says it should sit." He paused. "There is a man named Augusto Reyes, the father of the young man who was beaten several years ago. He farms a small holding that shares a boundary with your parcel to the east. He has seen the fence move. He has been afraid to speak because of what happened to his son. But if he believed the case was strong enough, if he thought Vane could actually be brought to account, he might." "Then I will go and talk to him," Rose said. "I will take you," he said immediately. "You will not go alone." She looked at him with a steady expression. "Cornelius, I am perfectly capable of riding to a neighboring farm." "I know you are," he said, "but you will not go alone. This is not a negotiation." She held his look for a moment, and then something in his expression shifted, some careful interior wall that he maintained with great discipline, and what showed briefly was not the professional certainty of a lawman but something raw and real, fear for her, specific and personal, the fear of a man who would be genuinely devastated if something happened to her. "All right," she said softly. "We will go together." They rode out the following morning, her on the bay horse she had hired from the livery and him on his own horse, a serious gray animal that suited him, and the October air was crisp and bright, and the mountains to the west were already wearing their first snow at the peaks, and it was, objectively, one of the most beautiful mornings she had ever seen, and she was riding beside a man she was in love with, and she felt, for about an hour, something very close to simply happy. Augusto Reyes was a weathered man of 50, with the careful eyes of someone who has learned that trust is extended in small increments or not at all. He received them in the yard of his small farmstead, and when Cornelius introduced Rose, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You are Thomas Easton's daughter." "I am." "Your father was a man who kept his own counsel," Reyes said. "He visited me once 3 years ago when the fence first moved. He was measuring. He wrote things down. He paused. I liked him better after that visit than before, which is not something I expected. He took them to the fence line. The original survey markers were small iron posts, mostly buried now, and the fence ran fully 6 feet west of where the markers indicated it should be. 6 feet did not sound like much, but over 40 acres of boundary it represented a significant encroachment, and more practically, it represented the ground truth of what Thomas Easton had documented, evidence of a deliberate, ongoing theft by a man powerful enough to believe he would never be called to account for it. Reyes looked at Cornelius Hayes and said, "If you can protect my son." "He is in Pueblo now," Cornelius said. "Is that right? Working at the rail yard?" "I can reach out to the county sheriff in Pueblo and ask for an informal eye on the situation. I cannot guarantee his safety if Vane is willing to go to those lengths. What I can tell you is that I intend to bring a formal case to the territorial judge, and once I do, once this is in front of a judge, hurting your son does Vane no good because it does not change the evidence." Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Write down what you need me to say. I will say it." Riding back to town, Rose felt the day's complicated weight settle around her, the satisfaction of progress and the anxiety of knowing that progress meant Vane would feel the pressure increasing, and that a man who felt pressure was a man who moved faster. "He will know soon," she said. "He already suspects," Cornelius said. "Pratt will have reported that I was at the recorder's office. Vane is not a stupid man. He will accelerate his plans. Which means we do the same," he said. "I will write to the territorial judge tonight. If I have his confirmation that he will hear the case, Vane's options narrow considerably." She looked at him as they rode side by side and said, in a quieter voice, "What if his options narrow to something that looks like removing the witnesses?" "That would be a serious mistake on his part," Cornelius said, "because it would give me everything I need to bring federal charges." He paused. "And because I will not allow it." The last 4 words were said with a quiet that was more absolute than volume, and they fell into the space between them with a weight that was not entirely professional. They rode back into Harlan Creek as the afternoon light went gold and long, and she was aware, with every yard of that ride, of his presence beside her, constant and careful, and carrying a significance that she was no longer pretending to herself was simply professional. That night she wrote in her journal. She had kept a journal since she was 14, and she wrote in it with complete honesty because a journal, she had always thought, was the one place a person was permitted the full truth. She wrote about Reyes and the fence line and the survey markers. She wrote about what Cornelius had said about the territorial judge. And then she wrote, for the first time with that specificity, that she was in love with Cornelius Hayes, that it had crept up on her over 5 weeks of evening walks beside a creek and conversations about the law and justice and the distance between them, that it was the kind of love that was not infatuation, because it was not built on mystery or projection, but on actual knowledge of an actual person, and that this knowledge was what made it frightening. Because you could not argue your way out of love built on genuine, knowing the way you could talk yourself out of love built on fantasy. She closed the journal and lay in her hotel room and listened to the wind in the eaves and thought about what Hannah had said about the frontier and appropriate moments, and taking what you have when you have it. 3 days later, Jessie Pratt broke into Rose's hotel room while she was at dinner. She did not know this until she returned to find the door had been forced, subtly, in the way that a professional does it, and her trunk had been carefully searched by someone who had been trying to leave everything in the same position it had been in before. She stood in the middle of the room and did a mental inventory. The letter was not in the trunk. She had given it to Cornelius for safekeeping. The deed was filed with the recorder's office. What had been in the trunk was correspondence, personal items, and a notebook in which she had been keeping her own records of the boundary evidence. The notebook was missing. She went directly to the Marshal's office and found Cornelius still at his desk, working by lamplight. She told him what had happened and watched him stand with the controlled urgency of a man who has been waiting for a move like this. "He has your notebook," he said. "Does it contain anything that compromises the case?" "My observations of the fence line, some calculations based on the survey records, nothing I do not have copies of in other forms." She paused. "But Cornelius, if Pratt has access to my room, if Vane has people inside the hotel—" "You are not staying at the hotel tonight," he said immediately. "Where am I staying?" "Hannah Briggs has a spare room. I will take you there now." She did not argue. He walked her to Hannah's house on the far end of the main street, spoke briefly with Hannah, who asked no unnecessary questions, and showed Rose to a clean room with a good lamp and a door that bolted properly. And then he stood in Hannah's front room for a moment with something working behind his eyes. "Rose," he said. She had stopped flinching at her name in his mouth and had begun to lean toward it slightly. "I need you to understand that this escalation means we are moving into the most dangerous part of this. Vane is not going to back down. He is going to do something decisive, and I need to be ready for it before he does." "What will he do?" "I do not know yet what form it will take," he said. "But I promise you something. I am going to see this through. I am going to get you through this safely, and I am going to put Douglas Vane in front of a judge, and you are going to keep your land." She looked at him in the lamplight of Hannah's front room and felt the full force of what it meant to have someone make a promise like that and mean every word of it. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked. "Beyond the law, beyond your duty, why does it matter this much to you personally?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man choosing his words with the care they deserved. "Because you are not the first person in this county to be put in this position by Douglas Vane," he said. "The Whitmore family, the Ray's boy, others before I arrived here. But that is not entirely the answer to what you are asking." He paused again. "You know it is not." The air between them was very still. "Cornelius," she said. "I am the Marshal of this town," he said, and there was something almost pained in his voice. "And you are a woman in my jurisdiction who came to me for help. Whatever I feel, I will not allow it to compromise how I do my job or how I protect you. So you are telling me what you feel," she said, "and simultaneously telling me that you will not tell me what you feel." The corner of his mouth moved in what was, on Cornelius Hayes, a smile. "I am telling you to trust that I have it well in hand," he said. "Both of them." She walked to the door of Hannah's front room and stopped and turned back. "I have it less well in hand than I would like to admit," she said, and left him standing there with that which she considered, privately, entirely fair. The break came from an unexpected direction, as breaks often do. It was Hannah Briggs who told Rose, on the following afternoon, that she had overheard something she had not been meant to hear. One of Vane's ranch hands had come into the store for supplies, and had been talking with another man in a low voice near the back shelves, not knowing that Hannah was in the small storeroom directly behind with the door slightly ajar. What Hannah had heard was fragmentary but sufficient. They were not just looking for documents. Vane had found out about the letter to the territorial judge. Cornelius had sent the letter 4 days ago. Vane knew, which meant Vane knew his window was closing. And the phrase Hannah had heard, delivered quietly and without apparent emotion, was "before the week is out." Rose went to Cornelius with this immediately and found him with Augusto Reyes in the office, and the quality of the scene told her that Cornelius had already received other intelligence from another direction and was in the process of setting things in motion. "Tell me," she said, standing in the doorway. He told her. A rider had come in from the south that morning, with information from a rancher outside town, who had seen Vane's men moving toward the Easton parcel the previous night. Not breaking fences, not overt destruction, but presence, establishment, the kind of preliminary activity that precedes a formal act of occupation. "He is going to try to simply take the land," Rose said slowly, "before the judge responds, before any of this is formally before the law. Possession being 9/10, Cornelius said grimly. He would establish physical presence on the parcel, have Percival Croft file some instrument challenging the deed transfer, create enough legal confusion that the territorial case is tangled up for months or years. He looked at her. It is what he did with the Whitmore land. Rose thought of the Whitmore family with their ruined barn and their land gone, and their lives rearranged by a man with a large coat and careful cordiality, and she felt something in her chest harden into something that was not quite anger but was its more useful cousin. "What do we do?" she asked. "We establish our own presence first," he said. "I ride out to the Easton parcel tonight, before his men move. I establish legal presence as a law enforcement officer. I have Rose with me as an independent witness, and in the morning I will have the county recorder accompany me to make a formal notation of the current boundary condition." "I am coming with you," she said. "Rose." "That is my land," she said. "My father spent the last years of his life watching that boundary. I am coming with you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look with everything she had. "You ride with me," he said. "You stay close to me. You do not do anything without checking with me first. Are we clear?" "Completely clear," she said. They rode out as the sun went down. Rose and Cornelius and Augusto Reyes, and a deputy named Tomas who was young and reliable and had worked for Cornelius for 2 years. The Easton parcel was a half-mile south of where the creek bent eastward, and as they approached it in the last of the evening light, Rose saw her land for the first time not as a legal concept or an item in a letter, but as an actual place, rocky and rough but hers, with the survey markers her father had found and documented jutting from the earth like small iron signatures. There were 2 of Vane's men there already, dismounted, building a fire, making themselves at home with the casual arrogance of men who believe their employer's power covers them like armor. Cornelius rode toward them without hesitation. "This is private property belonging to Rose Easton," he said. "I am Marshal Hayes. You are trespassing. I am asking you to leave, and I am asking you once." The 2 men exchanged a look. One of them, older, clearly considering whether the marshal was worth the trouble of defying. The other was Frank Cutter, and Frank Cutter was not considering anything. He was already making a calculation, and Rose, watching from a few yards back, saw it happen in his face and called out, "Cornelius," left, before she had consciously processed what she was seeing. Cutter went for his weapon, and Cornelius was already moving, not backward but forward, inside the draw, the kind of response that came from years and not from thinking. And what happened in the next 3 seconds was fast and physical, and ended with Frank Cutter face down on the ground with Cornelius's knee in his back and his weapon in Cornelius's hand, and his wrist at an angle that was painful but not broken. The older man had his hands up. Tomas had his weapon out. Reyes was very still on his horse. "I will be filing charges," Cornelius said, in the exact same tone he had used at the beginning of the encounter. "You are both under arrest for trespassing on private property. If Mr. Cutter would like to add assault charges to that, he is welcome to continue in the direction he was going." Cutter said nothing. He was breathing hard through his nose. Tomas took them both back to town. Cornelius and Rose and Reyes stayed on the parcel through the night. They made their own fire, not from any dramatic instinct but practically, because the October nights in Colorado were genuinely cold at that altitude, and they wrapped in their coats, and Reyes slept sitting up against a rock with the particular skill of a man who had spent many nights on the ground. Cornelius and Rose sat by the fire, and the conversation between them was quiet and real, and different from all their creekside conversations, in that it lacked the easy structure of an evening walk that would end with a return to ordinary life. They were sitting in the dark on contested land, while somewhere in town, a man with a large coat and a dangerous quality of purpose was deciding what to do next, and the firelight moved on their faces, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars. "Tell me about Clara," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she had trespassed into something too private, but then he spoke, And what he told her was what she had suspected from a dozen small observations over 5 weeks. And the telling of it was not the dramatic unburdening that appears in romantic stories, but something quieter and more honest. A man describing a loss that had not destroyed him but had fundamentally changed the shape of him, had made him more careful, more still, more aware of what mattered. "I carried it wrong for a long time," he said. "I carried it as a reason not to be where I was. I was in Pueblo and then I was in 2 other towns, and I kept moving because staying in one place with grief is harder than moving with it. When I came to Harlan Creek, I told myself I was here for the work. And the work is real, the work has been real. But I think I also finally stopped moving because somewhere in me, I understood that if I kept moving, I would never be anywhere long enough for anything that mattered to find me." She looked at him across the fire. "And has anything found you?" She asked, and the question was the most direct thing she had allowed herself to say in 5 weeks, and she felt the vulnerability of it like a physical thing. "Yes," he said quietly, "it has." She felt the full weight of those 2 words and sat with them and did not move toward him and did not look away. "I told myself I was not going to say anything," he said, "while all of this is happening, while you are in the middle of a situation that I have a professional obligation to resolve. I told myself it was not appropriate, that whatever I felt needed to wait." "You told me that actually," she said, "more or less." "I know I did." He looked at the fire. "But it is the middle of the night and we are on your land and you asked me about Clara. And I think that what that means is that we are past the point of either of us pretending we do not know what is happening." She stood slowly and walked around the fire and sat down next to him, close enough that their arms were touching, and she felt him go very still, the way he went still when something significant was happening, the way he had been still the first time she had really talked to him in his office. "I am not a frightening woman," she said. "You are, a little," he said, and the warmth in his voice was entirely new. She laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one that came from genuine delight, and she felt his arm move until it was around her, careful and certain, and she leaned into it, and they sat by the fire on her father's land in the cold, clear Colorado night, and did not say anything more for a while, because everything important had been said, and the rest was simply the beginning of something that did not need announcing. Augusto Reyes, asleep against his rock, gave no indication of being awake, though whether he was or not Rose never knew. The territorial judge's response arrived by telegraph the following morning, and it was both faster and more decisive than Cornelius had dared expect. The judge had apparently received, in addition to Cornelius's letter, a separate communication from a land title company in Denver that had been conducting its own quiet inquiry into irregularities in Harlan Creek County records. Irregularities that pointed directly at a pattern of deed manipulation under Douglas Vane's direction over a period of 8 years. The judge's wire said simply that he was dispatching a federal marshal to assist with evidence preservation, and that a hearing would be convened within 30 days, and that the Easton parcel deed was to be considered under judicial protection in the interim, which meant any attempt to physically occupy or legally challenge it would be contempt of court. Cornelius read the wire twice. Then he went and found Rose at Hannah's house and showed it to her. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she said, "My father was right. He was," Cornelius said, "about the land and about a good deal else. He wrote in the letter that he was sorry he had not been more present," she said. "He said the land was his way of giving me something that was real, something he thought I could stand on." She paused, and her voice was very steady. "I think he would be glad to know I am standing on it." Hannah made coffee and they all sat at the table and worked through the practical implications. With the judicial protection in place, Vane's options narrowed to either formal legal contest, which meant facing the evidence of 8 years of deed manipulation in a territorial court with a federal marshal watching, or retreat. There was a third option, which was that he might attempt something reckless in the days before the federal marshal arrived, but Cornelius had already arranged for Tomas to watch the Easton parcel, and for 2 other deputies from the next county to come in as support. The next 3 days were taut. Vane did not come to Rose. He did not send anyone. Percival Croft was seen leaving town on horseback with 2 packed saddlebags, which told its own story. Frank Cutter and the other man were in the jail cell facing arraignment. Jesse Pratt left Harlan Creek on the northbound stage without speaking to anyone. Douglas Vane, it turned out, was ultimately the kind of man who was dangerous precisely because he had always been able to make the danger go away with enough money and enough time and enough carefully placed pressure. And when those tools were removed from his hands, what remained was simply an old man who had spent so long winning by those methods that he had forgotten how to do anything else. He met the federal marshal who arrived 8 days later with his attorney, and the attorney was not Percival Croft, who had fled, but a man from Denver who looked at the evidence that Cornelius had assembled over 6 months and over the previous 10 days and told his client quietly, in a hallway, that settlement was the only option. The hearing before the territorial judge 3 weeks later was, in the end, not a dramatic confrontation but a careful legal proceeding. The fence encroachment was formally documented. The deed manipulations were entered into evidence. Cornelius testified. Reyes testified. Rose testified. 2 witnesses from the Denver Land Title Company testified. Douglas Vane sat at his table in the courtroom in his expensive coat and said very little, and his face had the particular quality of a man watching a structure he built over decades come apart without being able to stop it. The judge's ruling restored the Easton parcel to its full, survey-defined boundaries. It ordered Vane to compensate the Whitmore family for the land they had lost. It referred the matter of the Reyes assault to the territorial prosecutor. It formally noted the flight of Percival Croft as a person of interest in ongoing investigation. And it confirmed Rose Easton as the legal title holder of 40 acres of land at the southern edge of Harlan Creek, with all boundaries as established and protected by law. Rose sat in the courtroom and heard all of this and felt the quiet landing of something long suspended. Cornelius was beside her, not touching, because they were in a formal proceeding, but beside her. And when it was done and they walked out into the November light together, she took his hand and he looked at their joined hands and then at her face with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen on him. And she thought she understood, then, what it looked like when Cornelius Hayes was simply happy. In the days that followed, the shape of their life in Harlan Creek became different. Not entirely different, because the creek was still there and the evenings were still there, though it was November now and the evenings were cold and brief, and the cottonwoods had dropped their leaves and the creek ran dark and fast with the first cold of the coming winter. They still walked to it. The walking had always been about more than safety, and now that the most acute danger had passed, what remained was what had always been underneath it. 2 people who wanted to be in each other's company, who found the world slightly better arranged when they were walking beside each other in the last of the day's light. Cornelius took her to the Easton parcel on a Sunday in November, just the 2 of them, and they walked the full boundary with the survey notes and the iron markers, and she stood at each corner of what was hers and felt the ground under her feet and the cold air on her face, and the fact of 40 acres of land that her father had seen and thought of when he thought of her. "I want to build here," she said. "I want to stay." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about what to build," she said. "A house first, obviously, something solid, and I have been wondering about the land itself, whether crops are possible with the right soil amendment, whether there is a source of water that could be diverted for irrigation." "The creek bends about a quarter mile north of your northern boundary," he said. "There was talk, years ago, of a small diversion channel. It would require work, but it is not impractical." She looked at him. "You have been thinking about this." "I have been thinking about a good many things," he said. She turned to face him fully on her land in the November cold. "Cornelius Hayes," she said, "are you, in your particular and careful way, asking me something?" He was quiet for a moment, but the quietness was not uncertainty. It was the quietness of a man who takes important words seriously. "I am going to ask you something," he said. "But not here and not like this, standing in a field in November with no preparation whatsoever." A pause. "I have certain standards," she laughed. "You have certain standards," she repeated. "I do," he said, entirely serious, and also, she could see, deeply warm. "I will ask you properly, in the appropriate form, with the appropriate seriousness." "I look forward to that very much," she said. He asked her 3 weeks later in December, 2 days before the first real snow came down off the mountains and settled over Harlan Creek in a serious and permanent way. He came to Hannah's house in the evening properly and spoke to Hannah first, which Hannah would later describe to Rose with considerable amusement and also, undeniably, some genuine emotion. He had flowers, which in December in Colorado required creative effort, and he had a small box, and inside the box was a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone, and he said to Rose, "I am not a man who says things he does not mean. I am not a man who offers things he cannot make good on. I am asking you to marry me because I intend to spend the rest of my life being the kind of man who deserves to have been asked to be beside you, and because I love you, which I should perhaps have said first." She was already crying when he said the last part, which surprised her because she was not generally a woman who cried in moments of happiness, but it turned out that happiness at this particular depth and with this particular cause operated by different rules. "Yes," she said. "Cornelius. Obviously, yes." They were married in February, in the small church on the west side of Harlan Creek, in a ceremony attended by what felt like the entire town. Because in a town of that size, a wedding is everyone's occasion for warmth in the middle of a cold season, and the town of Harlan Creek had, as it happened, a particular fondness for this particular couple, both of whom had given them something to admire in how they had conducted themselves during the months of the Vane affair, which was already becoming the kind of local story that acquires more color with each telling. Hannah Briggs stood beside Rose. Tomas stood beside Cornelius. Augusto Reyes was in the front row, and his expression throughout the ceremony was that of a man who has seen enough bad things to genuinely appreciate a good one. Rose wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool, practical and fine, the kind of dress a woman wears when she wants to look beautiful without pretending the weather has changed. Cornelius wore his good coat and had shaved with evident care, and stood at the front of the church with the quiet uprightness of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. The minister spoke the words and they said theirs, and when it was done and they walked out into the February air that smelled of snow and wood smoke, the town made a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite something else, but was somewhere between the two, warm and genuine, and Rose felt the full complicated goodness of the day. The grief for her father that was still present and would always be present and was part of the day without diminishing it. The uncertainty of everything that lay ahead. And the clear, strong fact of Cornelius Hayes beside her, his hand in hers, his ring on her finger, already moving forward. They built the house in spring. It was a real house, not a soddy and not a temporary structure, but a frame house with good lumber hauled from the mill 30 miles north, with a front porch that faced the creek, with a kitchen large enough to work in, with 2 bedrooms and a room that could become a third. Cornelius had resigned as Marshal 2 months after the wedding, when the territorial office had sent a replacement, because building a house and establishing a 40-acre property with an irrigation project and a garden and the beginnings of a small farm required a full person's time, and because he had, he told Rose, done what he came to Harlan Creek to do and was ready to do something else. He was not entirely out of law work. He consulted with the new Marshal, a quiet man named Aldrich who had a different style but an honest one, and occasionally rode with the county sheriff on matters that required someone with his particular experience. But the primary work of his days became the land and the house and the irrigation channel, which took 3 months to complete and which, when it was finally running properly, sending creek water along a hand-dug channel to the field he had been preparing since April, made Rose stand at the edge of the field with her hands on her hips and say, "My father would have loved this," and mean it with everything. The garden was Rose's domain. She had never gardened before in any serious way, having spent her adult life in Denver's urban quarters, but she had an aptitude for it that she discovered with the pleasure of finding a skill you did not know you possessed. She grew potatoes and squash and beans and a great quantity of corn, and she dried and stored and preserved with a competence that by the end of the first summer had filled a root cellar that Cornelius had dug with an efficiency that impressed her. Hannah Briggs came out to the Easton parcel, which everyone in Harlan Creek had begun calling the Hayes place, which Rose felt complicated things about and then decided was simply true every Sunday, and Rose walked to town twice a week for supplies, and for the simple pleasure of human company beyond her husband's, which was excellent company but was only one person's, and she was sociable by nature. In the early autumn of that first year of their marriage, Rose understood that she was expecting a child. She told Cornelius on a September evening at the creek, where they had come to sit as they still did most evenings when the weather allowed, the habit having outlasted the necessity of it in the formal sense and become simply one of the ways they marked the day. He was very still when she told him. She watched the words settle into him and watched what they did, and what they did was take the careful composed quality that was habitual to him and replace it briefly with something entirely unguarded, raw and glad and frightened, all of it at once, the face of a man receiving news that is large enough to reorganize everything. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, and she loved him for that being the first thing. "I am very well," she said. "I am completely healthy, and I have already spoken with the doctor in town." He nodded slowly. Then he reached out and took both her hands in his and held them with that quality of certainty that she had come to understand was the fundamental note of who he was. "I am going to be here," he said, "for all of it." "I know," she said. "I have always known that." Their son was born in April of 1886, on a morning that arrived with the particular light of the Colorado spring, clear and cool and gold. And the doctor came from town and Hannah was there. And it was the kind of hard, beautiful work that birth is. And at the end of it Rose was exhausted and entirely present and held her son in her arms and looked at him with the full force of a woman encountering one of the great loves of her life. Cornelius sat beside her bed and looked at the child with the same complete attention he gave to things that mattered, and his face was absolutely unguarded in a way she had seen only a handful of times and each time had felt was a privilege. "Thomas," she said. "For my father," he looked at her. "Thomas," he said, and it had the quality of something completed. "Thomas Hayes." She looked at the name in full and felt it was right. Thomas Easton had left her land and a letter and a father's late and incomplete love, and she had come to Harlan Creek with those things and found everything else, and her son would carry both names in the one name, the past and what had grown from it. Young Thomas Hayes was a healthy and, in the view of most of the town's adults, exceptionally alert child who seemed to understand from his earliest months that he had been born into a household where people paid attention to things, and he paid attention with equal enthusiasm to everything around him. He grew through his first year with the unself-conscious vigor of a healthy baby, and the pleasure he gave his parents was that specific pleasure that has no equivalent, the ongoing revelation of a person coming into themselves. Augusto Reyes became something like an honorary uncle, visiting on the first Sunday of each month with produce from his farm, and as Thomas grew older, with a patience for small children that Rose had not anticipated in the weathered and careful man she had first met at his fence line. He had received, that spring, a letter from his son in Pueblo saying that the situation with Vane's remaining people had quieted completely, that he was well and had found steady work, and that he hoped to visit before the year was out. Reyes read this letter to Rose and Cornelius at their kitchen table with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been afraid for his child for a long time and has been given, at last, the permission to breathe. Douglas Vane had spent the winter in Denver fighting legal proceedings on 3 fronts. His land holdings in Harlan Creek County had been significantly reduced by court order. 2 of his men, including Frank Cutter, were serving sentences in the territorial prison. Percival Croft had been located in New Mexico and extradited, and was facing his own proceeding. Douglas Vane himself was not in prison, because men like Douglas Vane rarely ended up in prison, but he was broken in the specific way that powerful men are broken when the power is systematically and legally removed from them, and he did not return to Harlan Creek. His name faded from the town's daily conversation within a year in the way that names fade when the thing they represent is no longer present. The railroad came through in 1887. It did not come through the Easton parcel directly, but it came within a half-mile of it, and the connection it created to the wider market transformed what the Hayes farm could produce and sell. Cornelius negotiated a sale of timber rights on the eastern section of the property to a company supplying the rail construction, timber rights that did not touch the farmable land and the home site, and the money from that negotiated carefully over 2 years changed the practical shape of their lives. They were not wealthy. They were comfortable, which in that time and place was its own form of fortune. Rose expanded the garden into a market operation, selling produce to the hotel, to the general store, and when the rail line brought more travelers through, to the small eating establishment that opened in town in the spring of 1888. Hannah Briggs, whose general store had prospered in the years since Vane's influence had been removed from the commercial life of the county, became Rose's main distribution point, and the 2 women's friendship deepened into something that was less friendship and more family, the chosen kind that the frontier made possible and necessary. Cornelius found, in his life on the land, something he had not expected to find, which was that the same quality of attention that had made him a good marshal made him a good farmer, a good builder, a good neighbor. He was known in Harlan Creek for the kind of reliability that people call upon in difficult moments, and he was called upon with some frequency. When a family 2 miles east lost their barn to lightning fire in the summer of 1887, it was Cornelius Hayes who organized the rebuilding. When the school needed a new teacher, and the previous one had left for Denver, it was Cornelius Hayes who wrote to the Territorial Education Office and pushed for a replacement. When a family of homesteaders arrived in the fall of 1888 with 2 small children and a wagon axle that had broken 10 miles south and no money and no plan, it was Cornelius and Rose who housed them for 3 weeks, helped repair the wagon, and pointed them toward viable land north of town. It was not a life without difficulty. The winter of 1886 had been brutal, with snowfall that came in October and did not fully leave until April, and that tested the structure of their house and the stores of their root cellar and the warmth they could generate between them in the long cold nights, which turned out, in fact, to be quite considerable. Young Thomas weathered his first winter without serious illness, which was attributed in roughly equal parts to his mother's careful management of his environment, and his father's construction of a house with walls thick enough to actually hold heat. The summer of 1888 brought a drought that reduced the harvest and required careful management of the irrigation channel, and Cornelius spent 3 weeks of that summer with a shovel in his hands, and came inside each evening with the particular tiredness of physical labor done in heat, and sat at the table, and still managed to listen to whatever Rose wanted to tell him about the day, and to what Thomas, who was 2 years old and had recently discovered language with the enthusiasm of someone who has found an excellent new tool, wanted to demonstrate about the sounds that animals made. There were hard conversations too, the kind that belong to any genuine marriage, moments of friction between two people who were both strong and both opinionated, and who had to find, with each of those moments, the way through that preserved what they had built together. They found it each time, not easily but honestly, which was how they did most things. In the fall of 1888, Rose told Cornelius she was expecting again. This time she told him in the kitchen on a morning in October, and he was sitting at the table with his coffee, and he set the cup down very carefully and looked at her with the same full, unguarded gladness he had shown the first time. And she thought, watching him, that one of the gifts he gave her was that the significant things did not diminish with repetition for him, that he was not a man who went through the important motions of his life on habit, that he was still fully present to them. "Are you well?" He said the same first question. "I am well," she said. He stood and came to her, and held her with the simple completeness of a man who understands that holding someone is sometimes all that is required. And she leaned into it and thought about Thomas Easton, who had died alone in a Denver boarding house, and about the letter he had written to the daughter he had not been present enough to know, and about the land that he had left her. And she thought that whatever his failures had been, this, all of this, was something his act of care had made possible, and she was grateful. The second child was a girl, born in June of 1889 on a hot, clear day that tasted of summer, and she was strong and loud and unambiguous about her requirements from the first moments of her life. Rose looked at her daughter and felt the doubling of something that was already large. "Clara," she said to Cornelius. She had asked him weeks before whether the name carried too much weight for him, whether it would be a grief every time he heard it or whether it could be something else, and he had been quiet for a long time, and then had said that grief and love were not enemies, and that he thought Clara would be a fine name. Clara Hayes was from the beginning a person of decided opinions, in this resembling her mother, and of careful observation, in this resembling her father, and the combination produced a character that kept her parents and her older brother in a state of alert engagement from her earliest months forward. Thomas, who had been 2.5 when Clara arrived, regarded his sister with the particular wary interest of a firstborn encountering the revolution, and then decided, within a matter of weeks, that she was interesting, and from that point forward, he was a remarkably attentive older brother in the way that children are attentive to things they find genuinely engaging rather than things they are told to be attentive to. The world was changing around them in those years. Colorado had been a state since 1876, and the machinery of statehood was continuing to reshape the territory in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes not. The railroad had transformed commerce and travel. New towns were appearing and old ones were growing. The frontier quality that had defined the region when Rose had arrived on the stage in September of 1884 was not gone, but it was being overlaid with something more institutional, and this had its ambiguities. Cornelius thought about these things in the way he thought about everything, carefully, and with attention to who was benefiting and who was not. He remained attentive to the situation of the Ute people who had been displaced from this land, a displacement that the growing institutional machinery of statehood was cementing rather than revisiting. And he was not one of the men in Harlan Creek who talked about this as settled and acceptable, and this was one of the things about him that Rose had loved from the beginning. He wrote letters. He was not a man of large public gestures, but he wrote letters to his territorial representative and to the state government, careful documented arguments about the obligations incurred and not met, and some of those letters were acknowledged and some were not, and he kept writing them. He told Rose once that he did not expect the letters alone to change policy, but that the record of what was said mattered, that documenting what was seen and said in the present was how the future eventually understood what happened. She thought again of her father and his letter and his careful documentation of a fence line, and thought that Thomas Easton and Cornelius Hayes would perhaps have understood each other in certain fundamental ways, and that this made her glad. By the fall of 1889, The Hayes place had been established long enough to have acquired the quality of a home that has been genuinely lived in, that has known births and illnesses and celebrations and ordinary days in sufficient number to have worn itself into comfort. The house had been expanded the previous year, a larger kitchen and a third bedroom, in anticipation of Clara, and with the general principle that room was better than the lack of it. The garden had become a production that required significant management and had employed, for the previous 2 summers, a young woman named Beatrice from town who came 3 days a week and who had a gift for growing things that Rose recognized and respected. Augusto Reyes had, the previous spring, been joined at his holding by his son Miguel, who had left Pueblo and come home, and who had arrived with a wife named Lupe and a son of his own, who was almost exactly Thomas Hayes's age, which made for the kind of convenient friendship that children do not analyze but simply use. The 2 families shared Sunday dinners with the regularity of people who have decided that their lives are improved by the presence of certain others and have organized accordingly. On a September evening of that year, 5 years almost to the month since Rose Easton had stepped off a stage in front of the Silver Bell Hotel with a trunk and a land deed and no knowledge of what she was walking into, she walked to the creek. She did not need to walk to it for safety. Harlan Creek in the fall of 1889 was a town with a functioning law, with neighbors she knew and trusted, with a life that was rooted and real. She walked to it because the evening light on the water was one of the things she had come to love about her life in this place, because the sound of it was the sound that had accompanied the beginning of something she had not known how to name when it was beginning, and could name now with full confidence. Cornelius was there when she arrived, the way he was always there when she walked to the creek in the evenings, because the habit that had begun as protection had become something else, had become simply one of the forms that love takes when it has had time to become domestic and daily and ordinary in the best sense of the word ordinary, which is not diminished but established. He was standing at the bank looking at the water the way he had been standing that first evening, and he heard her coming and turned, and his face when he saw her carried that same quality she had first seen in him, the careful attention of a man who takes seriously the things he sees. Thomas was with him, which he was most evenings now, the 4-year-old having decided that accompanying his father to the creek was an excellent use of time, and Clara, whom Cornelius carried on his back in a kind of improvised carry that she greatly enjoyed, and he managed with the patient competence he brought to physical tasks, was pulling at his collar with interest. Rose reached them, and Cornelius shifted Clara to one arm and put the other around Rose, and they stood at the bank in the September evening with the water murmuring over its stones and the cottonwoods golden again and the mountains to the west already acquiring their autumn snow at the peaks, and Thomas crouched at the water's edge and discussed something with the creek in the private and earnest way of children engaged in important business. "Good day?" Cornelius asked. "A good day," she said. "Beatrice says the late squash is the best we have had. Hannah placed a larger order for the fall. And the doctor says Clara is exactly as healthy as she appears to be, which is to say unreasonably healthy." Clara, as if in demonstration, said something that might have been a word and grabbed a fistful of her father's hair with decisive force. "Ow," Cornelius said, with dignity. Rose laughed and took Clara from him, settling her against her own shoulder, and Clara accepted the transfer with the brief consideration of someone who regards all arrangements as provisional until proven otherwise. They stood at the creek as the light went down and became that particular quality of evening light that is not quite day and not quite dark, that hour that the frontier made beautiful whether it wanted to or not, the sky going to rose and copper above the mountains, the water catching it and scattering it in moving pieces. "I have been thinking," Rose said. "Yes," Cornelius said, which was his way of indicating that he was listening with his full attention. "I have been thinking about the parcel to the north," she said. "The Whitmore land that the court ordered returned. The family did not come back. The court has been holding the title in suspension for 3 years. I have been in correspondence with the county recorder, and I think there may be a formal process by which the land could be sold, with the proceeds to go to the Whitmore family wherever they are. You have been in correspondence with the county recorder, he said. For several months, she said. I have found their address, the Whitmore family. They are in Kansas now. They wrote back. They are not going to return to Colorado, and the land is doing nothing, sitting in legal suspension. And there is a young couple from the east who came through last month looking for viable farmland. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Then he said, "You have organized the whole thing." "I have organized the outline of the thing," she said. "There are legal steps that require someone with more authority than me, which is where I come in." "Which is where you come in," she agreed. He was quiet again, and she could feel beside her the quality of his thinking, the particular weight of him working through something he cared about, and she knew what he was going to say because she knew him now with the completeness of genuine knowing. "We should go see them," he said. "The Whitmore family, in Kansas." "In person," she looked at him. "That is further than I had planned." "Your father drove 100 miles to measure a fence line," he said. "Kansas is not so different." She felt the familiar warmth of it, the warmth that had not diminished but had changed quality over 5 years, from the sharp-edged warmth of new love to the deep ambient warmth of a life genuinely shared. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and Thomas looked up from the creek and said something important to the water, and then came and stood against his father's other side. And Clara, from her mother's shoulder, observed the evening with the concentrated attention of a person assembling a picture of the world. The sun went below the mountains. The light that remained was the soft, luminous gray that follows sunset in that high country, the light that makes everything look briefly as though it is held in something gentle. "We should walk back," Cornelia said. "Before dark." "We should," Rose agreed. He kept his arm around her, and she kept. Clara and Thomas walked ahead of them on the path under the cottonwoods in the way that small children walk on paths they know, with the proprietary confidence of someone for whom the familiar world is entirely adequate. Behind them the creek continued in its indifferent and eternal way, caring nothing about the story it had witnessed, which was the story of a deed and a boundary dispute, and a dangerous man brought to account, but also the story of two people who had found each other in a place that needed both of them and had built something real from what they found. It was the story of Rose Easton, who had come to Harlan Creek with a trunk and a piece of land, and the love of a father she had never quite understood until after he was gone, and who had found on that land, and in that town, something she had not been looking for because she had not known it was possible. It was the story of Cornelius Hayes, who had stopped moving long enough for something to find him, and what had found him was everything. The path was quiet and dark under the cottonwoods, and the first stars were out over the mountains, and the town of Harlan Creek was ahead of them with its lights and its sounds. And Rose walked the familiar path beside her husband and thought of all the evenings this same walk had held. The first nervous, formal evening when she had found him already there, and had said nothing about it. The evenings of conversation that had built something between them, word by careful word. The evening she had come running through the trees with the knowledge of betrayal and threat burning in her chest, and had found him exactly where she already knew he would be. The evening at the fire on her father's land. When he had said her name like it mattered, Thomas turned and looked back at them from the path ahead. "Papa," he said, "can you walk faster?" "I can," Cornelia said. "I choose not to." Thomas considered this with the genuine philosophical engagement of a 4-year-old, and then returned to walking ahead at his own pace. Rose heard her husband's quiet laugh beside her, and felt it the way you feel something you have come to love so much that it is indistinguishable from the ordinary fact of being alive, both those things at once, ordinary and remarkable. The lights of Harlan Creek grew closer. Clara had fallen asleep against Rose's shoulder, her small weight a ballast, a presence. The night was cold and clear, And the stars above the mountains were the stars that had been above those mountains before any of them existed and would be above them long after. But for now they were above this path and these people and this moment. And the moment was enough, was more than enough, was everything that had been worked for and lost and found and built, and was now simply, irrevocably, home. They walked into town as the last of the evening light gave way to full dark, and the door of their house was ahead of them with its warm window and its solid frame and its evidence of all the labor and intention that had gone into it. And Cornelius Hayes held the door for his wife and his sleeping daughter and his son, who rushed ahead and came in out of the dark, the way you come in out of the dark when you live somewhere that light waits for you. He closed the door behind them.